Welcome, everybody, to those here in person and also online with us. I'm Tori Holt. I'm the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding here at Dartmouth. And we're very pleased to co-host tonight's event entitled Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine. This event is part of our Middle East Initiative, a collaboration between the Faculty in Middle Eastern Studies and the Jewish Studies program here at Dartmouth, and frankly, something that has been going on long before we called it the Middle East Initiative. A real credit to the faculty for working together over more than a decade at least, trying to support dialogue here on campus and bring a wide variety of perspectives and points of view for all of us to better understand what's happening in the world and what's happened before. I'm also pleased that this initiative is supported by Dartmouth Dialogues, and that we're very grateful for the generous support of Tal and Ariel Rakanti, who are parents of the class of 22. So, why does this matter? Certainly it's hard to look at the news pretty much any time and not see debates about how to bring peace to the Middle East. Those are enduring conversations, but the headlines often miss what we'll hear about today, which is the larger challenge of bringing peace to an area when perhaps we're not actually negotiating about what is at risk and what is valuable to the parties. Certainly, if you see the news, we had Security Council meetings last week on this topic. We have the first Board of Peace meetings in Washington, D.C., and we also have potential threats of war with Iran beginning now. So what is behind all this, and how do we better understand it? How do a multi-decade effort led by Israelis, Palestinians, and often American presidents lead to success and failure despite the ambitious goals? So I'm excited to hear about the book. And this is Rob Malley's book with Hussein Agha. The title of the event is also the title of the book, Tomorrow is Yesterday, Life, Death, and the Pursuit of Peace in Israel and Palestine. Really ask some fundamental questions. So let me give you a little background on him, then I'll turn to our moderator, and then we'll kick off a terrific conversation. Rob Malley is best known often in circles for his diplomacy, but currently he is at Yale, where he's a lecturer and a senior fellow at Yale Jackson School. His earlier career spanned working for 3 U.S. presidents, as well as in the NGO and analysis and academic spaces. He served as special envoy for Iran from 2021 to 2023. Under President Obama, he served as special assistant to the president and worked on the Counter-ISIL campaign, as well as issues involving the Middle East, North Africa, the Gulf region, and Syria. He's also known for heading one of the prominent organizations of the world, the International Crisis Group, which tracks conflicts around the world and pushes for efforts to bring diplomacy successfully forward for those conflicts. During President Clinton, he also worked on Arab-Israeli affairs, Near East and South Asian affairs, and served on the Clinton National Security Council, including for National Security Advisor Sandy Berger. This part of his resume surprised me. He also clerked for Justice Byron White. When did you get a law degree in all of this? But he also has degrees from Yale, Harvard, Oxford, and he was a Rhodes Scholar. This conversation is in the very able hands of our own colleague here at Dartmouth, Ezzedine Fishere, who teaches courses on Middle East politics. He's played many roles. Before joining Dartmouth in 2018, he was also a professor in political science at the American University of Cairo. He's well known as a former diplomat, both for Egypt and also at the international level. He served as the Assistant Minister for Culture during Egypt's uprising in 2011, as well as ambassador in Egypt's Foreign Service, with multiple posts, including a commission on the restructuring of the League of Arab States, counselor to the Egyptian foreign minister with a focus on Arab-Israeli relations and regional security, and head of the political section of the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv. He's also served at the international level as a political advisor in various UN missions across the Middle East and East Africa. But I also want to point out his very well-known role as a novelist. He's written many, many books that are quite famous, particularly in the Middle East. And I'm pleased to say that the first English edition of one of those, Nightfall in Cairo, will come out this March as an English language edition. And some of the reviews include brutal, a triumph, bold, makes fun of the taboos, and a gripping, intimate prose that fuses political critique with bitter humor. So I think we could all enjoy that. Speaking of books, we have a few editions of Rob Malley's book. If you're a student in either Professor Fishere's class, Professor Simon's class, my class, or the War and Peace Fellows, and you haven't gotten a book, there's a sign-up sheet in the back. You can add your name to it, and we'll reserve one for you. I also want to just point out we really respectful dialogue here, so hopefully everybody will enjoy that. So now let me turn to Ezzedine Fishere to moderate this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tori. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Dickey Center, to Middle Eastern Studies, Jewish Studies, and all colleagues who made this and other events possible. I also want to thank you, Rob, for agreeing to be with us today, and it's really, really a pleasure for me to be in conversation with you. I have a couple of disclosures to make. The first is that Rob was my boss for a year. So he hired me to work for International Crisis Group when I left the Egyptian Foreign Service and before I went to the American University. So I come in his debt for that, or we can talk about that. But also, I think Rob, and I think I told Tori that when we were discussing who to invite, is one of the smartest people I ever met. So I want to say this before I also add that I have disagreements with a lot of the stuff that's in the book. So I'm going to ask you some blunt questions, but I want everybody to know that they're coming from that place of care.
And you wonder why you only worked for me for 1 year.
All right, so before I do this, why don't you tell us in your own words, what are the main messages that you and Hussein Agha are trying to give us in this book? What is the main point?
So I don't think I could summarize it. And there are free books for those of you who want them. So I don't think I could summarize it and not take the entirety of the hour that we have. But so let me just try to explain why we wrote the book. And I could give more about our respective backgrounds. The fact that we could both agree on writing a book it already says something. But after October 7th, both the massacre of October 7th and the slaughter that followed, we were both confronted with people saying that sort of viewing this as an anomaly, that what had happened was a rupture from the past, and that what you needed to do is get rid of the fanatics, Islamists on the Hamas side, and this unique right-wing extremist government on the Israeli side, and we can get back to the right course of events. And both Hussein and I felt there was something fundamentally wrong in that diagnosis, that neither October 7th nor the war that followed were anomalies. They didn't sort of come from another planet. They were expressions, reflections, both of their respective societies. This was not Hamas's war. This was not a uniquely Hamas Islamist event. If you look at the history of the Palestinian struggle, they're events that never reached quite this level, but were in the same spirit. And it was not Netanyahu's war. This was Israel's war, with the vast majority of the Israelis supporting what happened. So not an event, not a rupture from the past, but as we write, and that's what we called the book Tomorrow's Yesterday, a reenactment of the way that Israelis and Palestinians have dealt with each other for decades and decades. So that's one message. The other one, which is a corollary, if you and I have worked on the peace process since the early or mid-90s, if after the peace process that the U.S. shepherded for all these years, this is what we get, then something was fundamentally amiss in those efforts, because it's not as if you have the peace process on one plane and then you have the violence, the massacres, the slaughter on the other. One is the derivative of the other. The latter is the derivative of the former. And so we are trying to get to the core of what was missing in all these talks, that we end up in a situation that is far worse than we were back in 1993 when this endeavor began. In fact, it began, this quest for two-state solution began before that. There's much more, and I really do hope that those of you who are interested will read the book. But that was the impetus for the book, and that's what led to all the rest.
Okay. So you're a former American official, and you chose to write a book with Hussein Agha, who's a former Palestinian negotiator. He has but he was negotiating on behalf of the
Never officially, but that's okay, yeah.
So you could have written a book on your own account. You could have chosen to write with both a former Palestinian and Israeli, but you chose that formula. You're not worried that you're missing out a third of the perspective?
First of all, I don't consider myself representative of the American perspective, whatever that is, and I don't consider Hussein a representative of the Palestinian perspective. He and I have worked together, as you know, since 2001. We've written maybe a dozen or more articles together, and it's not the first time that people have raised that. I would tell those who feel that way, don't judge me by the company I keep and who I wrote with and what their name is and he happens to be an Arab. Read the book, and if you disagree, as you say you do, we could talk about that. I do think that both of us have I don't know how to put it, pretty different background. Yes, I'm an American, but as I've spoke to a number of the students already, I come from a slightly different background. My father was Egyptian, just like you, but he was an Egyptian Jew who also was anti-Zionist. And so he came with this strange background, who then moves to the U.S. and is a very virulent critic of U.S. foreign policy. Then he moves to France and he gets expelled from France as an American journalist, which is a pretty rare feat, because he was critical of French foreign policy. So he always had that outsider. I didn't agree with a lot of what he wrote or thought, but I also inherited a bit that sense of always trying to put myself in other people's shoes. And you mentioned Hussein. He's not Palestinian, he's Lebanese, he's from Iraqi-Iranian descent. He's a Shiite, he lives in London. So he's a bit of an outsider even to the Palestinians. So both of us have this kind of ambivalent relationship to the entities that we either represented or spoke for, and I think I did it, loyally, and I believe he did too. But yes, it's our perspective, and I'm always very open when I address students. I have my own biases. I'm very aware of them, and I think we try to explain them. But again, in terms of the ideas, read them, judge them, and we'll debate them.
Absolutely. But just if I can push back a little bit on this is, you and I teach politics of Israel-Palestine, we teach the conflict, and we keep telling students that everybody's biased, every text has a bias in it, and the solution we bring to this is to bring as many perspectives as possible. Not that you are a representative of the US government, but you're more familiar with that perspective. You can speak with more authority and knowledge about that perspective. And so does Hussein regarding the Palestinian perspective. So what I find missing here is somebody who has that inside perspective on the Israeli, and not the Jewish, on the Israeli perspective, on the Israeli government kind of position. So I was just wondering if...
So again, I won't have a satisfactory answer because an Israeli did not help write this book. I will say we try as best as we can, and it's very imperfect, to try to put ourselves in their shoes. And I have to say, one of the reactions to the book that I got from Israelis, and I don't mean sort of the left-wing Israelis, but from right-wing Israelis, and some have written about the book and said one thing they found about the book is that they felt that they were dealt with fairly and without disdain, which they felt some others spoke about the Israeli right. And that I may disagree with them, but we try, and again, with all the imperfection that I'm sure many Americans, trust me, many of my former American colleagues were not happy with the way I depicted US policy. Maybe more unhappy than the Israelis were. But as I say, we try our best to present, and it's core to our book, because our book is about how American negotiators tried or turned a blind eye to what was really moving and motivating Israelis and Palestinians throughout this conflict. So we couldn't do that if we didn't at least try to understand what was behind Israeli thinking, actions, and emotions.
Excellent. That's a good segue to my next question. And just so that nobody's worried, I'm going to ask 5 questions, and that will be it, and then I'll open the floor. So don't worry. You offer a harsh critique of the U.S. policy and involvement in this. I'm going to read one sentence as an indicator. The United States also figures as central culprit. That's quite right, a statement. In other areas, you say that the U.S. not only failed, but the U.S. made things worse by its intervention. You speak of the lies, the damn lies, how lies being repeated, even though everybody knows that these are untrue statements and so on. how do you reconcile this with 3 decades of service in and out in that same community? How do you reconcile these 2 things? And I'm not asking this just to say, is this too convenient or something like that? But I'm asking this with, mindful of students who are watching this and thinking, is it worth it to pursue a career in government, even though I have reservations about the policy and so on? So how do you personally handle that?
And I'm not the first. I'm actually not the only one in this room. Professor Simon is here, and he's written an excellent book that you should all read about American policy in the Middle East, which is full of very, very harsh criticism. I mean, in some way, it's an occupational hazard. The number of American officials who have served, some who've served much longer than I have, and then when they leave, they can be as harsh critics as anyone else. It's an interesting phenomenon, and many people ask, well, why did you not speak out earlier? Which is one fair criticism.
But you also go back.
Yes,
like
I go
you
back.
go out,
right.
And go back, even against the advice of your own mother.
Yes, definitely. And always believe your mother. That was for my as I say, my worst career choice was to go back into the last administration. This is, again, it's a great question, and particularly for people who are thinking about their careers. Any position you're going to take, particularly in government, but not only in government, is going to entail some compromise. Unless you're the president or the CEO of an organization, that's going to happen. And you have to decide for yourself, are you prepared to make those compromises? And do you think you're going to do more good by staying than you would by leaving? I could question some, and I think it's a very fair question for me to ask with the benefit of hindsight. Perhaps I should have asked myself at the time, am I really making that difference? Is it worth whatever compromises, moral and otherwise, that I'm making? And when you look in yourself in the mirror, and at the end of the day, and why am I so harsh on the U.S.? I'll come back to me. I mean, compare where we are today between Israelis and Palestinians compared to where we were in 1993 when the U.S., the sole superpower in the world, the one that decided that it would take exclusive dominion over this conflict. And you know this better than anyone because you were on the side that would have wanted to play a bigger role. But the U.S. sort of exerted a monopoly on this conflict and trying to resolve it since the 90s. We are in a position today that is on every metric. This is not, I don't think I'm being biased in saying this. There's not one way you could look at this and say that the Israelis and Palestinians, in terms of their relationship, are better off today than they were when the U.S. took the helm of this process. That's not a harsh, it's harsh because it's simply a statement of fact, and we could go in all the ways that I do think that the U.S. distorted things. Some of this, I plead that I was either naive or ignorant. I didn't see it quite that way at the time. When I worked in the Clinton administration, I truly believed that we were trying to reach a 2-state settlement. When I worked under President Obama, I thought that I think we did do some good with the Iran nuclear deal, which we might come to. But overall, when I look back, I think there's serious questions we need to ask ourselves about U.S. policy in the Middle East. And I do think that people there, whether I should have resigned at some point, I don't know. I think there's some people who served, and people will know what I'm referring to, but more recently, whether they should have asked themselves a more serious question about whether they're making a difference or whether they are enabling and legitimizing policies that they may fundamentally disagree with. But that's a choice I think everyone will make at any point, at several points in their lives.
Okay, let me then go to the core of that idea that the U.S. bears a significant responsibility, if not, a principal culprit, as you describe it. You say somewhere else that the United States was not merely unable to achieve what it set itself to do, improving the situation, but that it made it worse. And then you quote examples like we failed at Camp David, then the Intifada erupted, and so on. And my question is, doesn't this kind of deny the parties themselves the agency that we should expect that they exercise? It's not like the U.S. derailed Oslo. The U.S. didn't push the Palestinians to start the Intifada. The U.S. didn't push Israel to reoccupy the West Bank. The U.S. didn't impose 15 years of siege on Gaza. Israel did. Egypt did. The PA did, right? Hamas did by its own choices. So to kind of... the conflict is getting worse because the parties are behaving and making choices that get them there.
I don't think there's any inconsistency with what you're saying, what I'm saying. And I think we say in the book, of course, the primary responsibility is on the parties, and the primary responsibility for where we are and to get out of it is on the parties. But you asked me to talk about U.S. policy, which, as you say, I can do with some, I know about authority, with some knowledge because I served. Again, it's hard to see how the U.S. made anything better. And if all the U.S. did was watch as everyone did everything worse, then what was the point of the U.S.? What's the point of all the power, all the leverage, all the support that the U.S. has given if this is what it can do? Is say, well, yes, 15 years of siege. Yes, a summit that fails. Yes, we enabled policies, or at least we turned a blind eye. Then why was the U.S. there? Maybe they should have gotten out of the way. That's the argument. It's not that the U.S. is the primary culprit and every decision was made by the U.S. Of course, the parties made their own decisions, but the U.S. took it upon itself. They claimed, at least 2 presidents I served and one I didn't serve, said that one of their priorities was to reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And yet they didn't do what it would have taken to at least give it a fair chance. And again, we could debate this, but the U.S. never treated this with a kind of priority, and I always make this comparison. I served President Obama trying to reach the Iran nuclear deal. One could disagree with the deal or agree with the deal. One thing that is certain is that President Obama decided this is a national security priority for the United States, and so I'm going to overcome domestic opposition from Republicans and a majority of the Democrats in Congress. I'm going to overcome strong opposition from the Israeli government, including a prime minister who comes to speak against the deal, not invited, behind the president's back in Congress. I'm going to overcome opposition from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, all of our partners in the Middle East, because this is a core U.S. national security interest. And you compare that to how the U.S. didn't, whether maybe they shouldn't have, but they certainly didn't flex those muscles, didn't overcome domestic objection, didn't overcome regional obstruction by one party or 2 parties, Israelis and Palestinians, and just basically acted as if it was powerless to affect the decisions of the parties that it was either bankrolling or providing military support to. So I think, and again, we come to why the book and why now, and why we say tomorrow's yesterday. Because October 7th and everything that happened since is a microcosm of all of these phenomena we're talking about, including, in particular, a U.S. that is able to denounce rhetorically what it enables practically. And I'm speaking about the continued war on Gaza. When you watch that, I don't know how you conclude otherwise that the U.S. was, at a minimum, not a positive factor in the relations, in trying to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What level of attribution, responsibility? I'm not a mathematician. I'm not going to try to do that. And of course, Israelis and Palestinians bear the lion's share of the burden, and we could decide which one of the two. But to the extent that we're speaking about the U.S., I don't think they can come out of. They don't come out of this looking pretty at all.
All right. I'm going to move to the other core proposition of the book, which is the title and the idea that tomorrow is yesterday, that the parties are trapped in the history and the way they see their own national projects to a point that prevent them from moving forward. And you said that also in multiple kind of conversations, podcasts, and so on, about the issues of 1948 have never been resolved, and this is where they are. So we keep going back to yesterday. My question is: are you at all concerned that you might be doing, by taking this position, you might be doing what Edward Said criticized Samuel Huntington and Bernard Lewis for, which is to come into a national debate and take a position with one side and present this as the national consensus. So, clarify. Both in Israel and among Palestinians, there is a debate about these issues, about to what extent should we stay committed to the dream of all Palestine versus let bygones be bygones and look to the future and accept a compromise. And the mirror image in Israel as well. Let's call them, the radical kind of view is we have to stay committed like what Hussein keeps saying, the emotions are important, the commitment to Haifa and Yafa and so on, versus the others who are more willing to go for coexistence. And then we come from the outside and say, in multiple ways, the essence, as you say, the essence of the national liberation in Palestine, and the essence of the national aspiration in Israel and the identity is the commitment, is inconsistent with the two-state solution. And by doing this, my fear is you take a side in this debate. On one side, so for me, growing up in Egypt, the debate I have with my Arab and Palestinian compatriot is, so now just like, the entire world here, even, the Americans are saying this. Does this make sense? Do you see the question?
Yes, although, so much of this it's difficult because, yes, you're getting to the core of the question, but we have to speak about it in 30 seconds rather than 300 pages. So tomorrow's yesterday that's not, what we mean by that is that we are back, that in so many ways we're back, not simply in the way you said it. The Palestinian National Movement, something I just spoke about in Professor Simon's class, the Palestinian National Movement is basically where it was decades and decades ago, without a compass, without a leadership, just as after the Nakba, Israel feels in some ways as threatened as it did in the early days. So we try to describe sort of as we say, a reenactment of the past. On your issue, so one of the angles in which this comes up is why did the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations fail, right? And so there's 1,000 reasons we could come up with. It's not, at this point, I think the burden really is on people who continue to say the two-state solution, as we have learned to think about it, which is a two-state solution with a sovereign Palestinian state and all of the rights that states have. The burden is on those people, I think, to say how they think it's going to be achieved now when it has failed under conditions that were far, far, far more auspicious than exist today. And it's not a matter of, did we think of the best way to divide Jerusalem? Did we think of the best way to cut the parts of the West Bank? Because we've had fantastic deals put on the table, whether it was from President Clinton, whether it was Olmert and Abbas, whether it was Secretary Kerry, whether it was in some track twos. We have, if the problem is, we didn't quite figure out how to define the two states, that was the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is something else, and what we believe in, I don't think it's taking sides in a debate so much as saying the conflict has been, in some respect, misdiagnosed when people thought all you needed to do is take a line, draw a line on the map. Here's Israel, here's Palestine, here's Jerusalem. The refugees, no, we're not really going to deal with that issue because it's too complicated and it goes back to history. When Israel asks to be recognized as a Jewish state, the Palestinians say, well, no, we're not going to do that. Those are the issues that we have chosen to ignore. And in this, it's a self-criticism. You and I have been involved in a number of negotiations, track one, track official and unofficial. And I'd often have Israelis and Palestinians come up to me and say, these negotiations are great, but what about these other issues? What about the narratives of both sides? What about the history? What about the refugees? What about the desire to be recognized as a Jewish state, et cetera, et cetera? And what I would say and what Hussein would say, and I suspect maybe you would say, is those are important issues, but let's first resolve the conflict, and then we could address those issues. The problem is those issues were the conflict. You know as well as I do that the conflict didn't begin in 1967. Palestinians were fighting for whatever you might call it, liberation, a return, between 1948 and 1967, when Israel did not control the West Bank or Gaza. And what we're seeing on the Israeli side, and yes, it may not be every Israeli who believes it, but for a number of Israelis who have enough power in their own societies, they care more about the future of Hebron than they do the future of Tel Aviv. So what we're saying is not, therefore, you can't resolve it and you have to accept that Palestinians want everything and Israelis want everything. We're saying the models of the past, which was that ethno-national division of Israel-Palestine, that has failed. It's not, and whether it was ever a possibility, I don't know. It's not going to be resurrected today. And so if there's a message of the book is, it's time, again, to go back to some of the ideas of the past, be more creative. How could Israelis and Palestinians coexist peacefully, with dignity, with equal rights? If it's not going to be two states sort of defined by ethno-national lines, what else is it going to be?
All right. So this is going to be my last question. But then...
I think it's 6, so I think...
No, this is the 5, I swear.
Okay.
So the way I read the book is, in addition to this, is to say that this narrative, that the narrative on both sides is exclusionary, that the dominant narrative on both sides is a commitment to all of Palestine on the Palestinians, for the Palestinians, and a Jewish homeland that encompasses all of the land on the Israeli side. And that's the essence and of the identity, of the national identity of both sides, and that the two-state solution, not just in its ethno kind of separation model, but the idea that we give up on X% of what we consider our homeland is inconsistent with the national aspiration. And if that is the case, or even if, say, this is a misreading, but then how would the other solutions you're suggesting in the book, all of these models, how would they, what kind of narrative you see today that would be more conducive to them, that is not conducive to the two-state solution?
So the first thing I'd say is we try to be humble and modest, that we don't have a prescription, we don't have a blueprint. All we can say, and I say with pretty much certainty, that the ways of the past have failed, so it's time to think about something different, unless we want to simply repeat the catechism, wrong word, but we want to repeat the dogma. Two-state solution, it's the only solution we're going to get there, and meanwhile, everything on the ground is moving in the opposite direction. When you say exclusive, it's not really what we mean, and there are some ideas, they may not be the ones that are implemented either because the parties don't want them or because the asymmetry of power between the two doesn't allow it. But I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of a land for all. Right. I think you may, I don't know if you've been involved, but this notion that, is there a way to imagine a future in which neither side gives up its core aspiration, yearning? So in this idea of a land for all, Israeli settlers could live as citizens of Israel, but in an entity that would be Palestinian. You could call it a state, you could call it a two-state solution. That for me is not the way we would envisage a two-state solution. Settlers would have the right to live, and Palestinian refugees would have the right to go live in Israel as Palestinian citizens who are living in Israel. And you'd have a much more porous definition of nationalism and nationality and the coincidence between territory and sovereignty. Don't want to get into too much theory, but the whole idea of dividing land along ethno-national lines, that's a pretty recent Western idea. It's not an idea that was born in the region. It's an idea that came from the outside, and then people have tried to impose on Israelis and Palestinians. It doesn't, and again, I'm just looking at the last 30 years at least, maybe since well before, it's not an idea that has seemed to have grabbed the imagination of Israelis and Palestinians. When is the last time that Israelis and Palestinians were demonstrating on the street, being prepared to sacrifice their lives or to take the lives of others in the name of a variation of the two-state solution? That's not what has been propelling them. So it doesn't mean that there's no answer that, and we say, and I think we've said it both in the book and in talking about the book, there has to be a way for them to coexist and to fit these narratives into an outcome. And we give the example of, and it's not a perfect example by any means, and I'm not an expert, but one of the episodes we recount was one of our former colleagues at Crisis Group, Ofer Zalzberg, an Israeli, who brought Israeli rabbis. They never left Israel, and they were not at all believing that peace could be reached with the Palestinians. And they brought them to Northern Ireland. And one thing they say when they leave Northern Ireland, they say it opened their eyes on one notion, which is maybe you could reach a settlement in which neither side gives up its dreams. Neither the Protestants nor the Catholics gave up their dreams. They don't consider this to be the end of conflict, which is what, as you know, the Israelis insisted that any deal, and the Americans, any deal between Israelis and Palestinians would be the end of conflict, end of their respective claims. Is there a way to show greater respect for their respective ideas and histories and narratives? And I'll just conclude on one before we open it up. At the end of Camp David, which was the summit between Yasser Arafat, Ehud Barak, and President Clinton, in which I participated and which failed, we went around the room, American members of the American team, and asked what went wrong, because it really was a pretty desultory outcome. And one of the really insightful comments that came from the lawyer on the team, Jonathan Schwartz, you may remember him, he said the problem with Americans is that we didn't respect the issues enough. We thought these were issues that we could just deal with, but with word games, as I said, refugees, well, let's have the refugees, we'll deal with the issue and call it the right of return. That's what President Clinton said. We'll call it the respect of the right of return, for example. And that, in Jonathan Schwartz's mind, and I think that always stayed with me, is we didn't respect the issues in the way the parties did. And the parties care about their attachment to the land. There's a pretty unique relationship between both the Palestinian movement, because so many Palestinians were forced to flee, and the Israeli people, because they were returning in as they see it, to the land. There's a very peculiar relationship between the land and the people and the history. And I don't think that the way the negotiations were framed in terms of the paradigmatic two-state solution was fit to purpose for that. This isn't a conflict where emotions do matter. History, and I'm not saying they don't matter in other conflicts, but maybe particularly here, history, narratives, emotions, fears, yearnings. And if you ignore all that, I think you're ignoring the conflict.
All right, thank you. So the floor is open. If you have questions, there is a microphone, so please raise your hand. And you might want to identify yourself when you ask a question too. Or maybe not.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a freshman. I wanted to ask you, what specifically can you point to that went wrong in the peace negotiations? And if tomorrow is yesterday, what would your solutions be to make tomorrow be tomorrow, to change the conflict? Because it doesn't seem possible to me to say to both sides that you're not going to be guaranteed a state by the end of this, to say that the two-state solution isn't viable, because I feel like if you were to say that, both parties would stop negotiations. So what would your response be to that?
I'm not sure both sides would stop. Because right now we're living with, there's one state and not the other. So, but it's a very fair question. I can't pinpoint one thing. There's so many things that went wrong, and it depends which negotiations we're talking about. I just was telling Ezzedine what I think one of the core issues was, if you misdiagnose the conflict, if you don't understand what it's about, you're not going to resolve it. I think there were other mistakes, clear mistakes. Keeping so many of the Arab parties in particular out of the negotiations when they could have provided reassurance to Israel and support for the Palestinians, who were, I'm not saying anything revolutionary, who were the weaker party. Keeping some constituencies out of the negotiations. The Islamists, Hamas, and the refugees were not represented in talks, but nor were the settlers directly, nor were the religious Zionists either. So this was a negotiation in which people who tended to get along would meet around the table, and at the exclusion of those who had greater ability to disrupt things. But yes, they were harder to deal with, but if you didn't deal with them, they were automatically gonna disrupt. So everything from the participants to the process to the whole, as I said, the mentality of what issues people thought they were trying to resolve, all that I think missed a lot. I could talk about the U.S. role ad nauseum, about how the U.S. was not just biased, but blind to its biases in ways that only become apparent when you are aware of the narratives and the perspectives of both sides. And I think there is a tendency on the American side to be less aware of, and certainly less empathetic towards, but less aware of the Palestinian narrative. And I think that when you're a mediator, that has real repercussions. I don't know. Again, it's a very good question. How could we make sure tomorrow's not like yesterday? First, by not repeating the mistakes of the past. But that means, in terms of right now, what I think is going to have to happen is Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to, like they did in the past, re-engage, not officially. I don't believe for a second that this Israeli government and this Palestinian leadership can sit down and achieve anything. But I think you're going to have more informal conversations between Israelis and Palestinians, as occurred after 1948, to try to find a common language and a common vision, because that common vision doesn't exist today. You make a very good point about if somebody were to say tomorrow, an official, I've said it, but an official, there won't be a two-state solution. They'd be panicked, because what's the alternative? Now, the truth is, the people who'd be least surprised if you said there's no two-state solution are the Israelis and Palestinians. I don't think Israelis believe in it, and I can't speak for Palestinians, but if you look at the polling and if you read what people say about young Palestinians, they don't believe in it either. So if you're trying to give hope to the people on the ground by repeating the mantra of the past, they just see it as words and not as reality. But there was a time where the Biden administration, people in the Biden administration were saying maybe we should start looking at alternatives, at least informally, and the president and his top advisors said, We can't do that. If we do that, it's going to look like we've given up all hope, and we need to maintain, at least, even if we don't believe it, this is not his words, these are mine, the illusion that something can happen. I think that illusion has been costly. I think that illusion has been costly because in the name of saying we're working towards a two-state solution, everything on the ground, as I said, have deteriorated, and the pursuit of a two-state solution without putting real muscle behind it has enabled the perpetuation of the status quo. So people who speak about a two-state solution as a goal have allowed the perpetuation of the status quo in practice. But so I do think there's going to have to be Israelis and Palestinians getting together, maybe at the level of civil society, to talk about different outcomes. And I do think the U.S. is going to, if we really want a different tomorrow, play a different role. I spoke just to Professor Simon's class about what that means. What will this generation of Americans do when you're in positions of responsibility? Will you have a different take towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, different moral compass, all of that, that different American policy combined with different Israelis and Palestinian conversations may lead to a better future, but I'm not going to predict that. I really don't know what tomorrow will bring. All I know is that the ways of the past won't bring anything better. There's some here? Yeah. There's some up here. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Trace. I'm a 29. You mentioned like polling among like Palestinian youth. I was wondering, and how that doesn't exactly support a two-state solution anymore. I was wondering if what we're seeing was like a rise in that national ambition again, or if we're seeing a rise for support for an integrated one state.
I don't know. And to be honest, I usually don't really trust polls all that much, particularly in a situation like this. I don't know how you could poll Gazans in a way that would make sense. Even people in the West Bank, everyone probably is fearful. The best evidence I get from speaking to either Palestinians or people who've spoken to Palestinians, right now I just think there's a sense of resignation, right? I mean, if you had lived what they've lived through, what are they thinking of? They don't think about two states. They're not thinking about politics, but there's a lot of fear, a lot of anger, a lot of rage, and particularly the younger generation doesn't believe in these recipes that people are telling them about two states. Do they believe in some form of coexistence, one state? I don't know. I mean, certainly that view has grown, but I can't give you any percentage. And things could change. I mean, events on the ground could change people's perceptions. But I personally have not met a young Palestinian under the age of 30 in recent years who has said that they believe that a two-state solution is in their future, or really that they believe in it, or that they believe in the Palestinian Authority, that they believe in the peace process. They've given up on all that because they've seen what it has led to in their daily lives. And frankly, I don't think Israelis believe in it either, because they look at what happened on October 7th, and they, for them, they also say, whenever we withdraw from territory, what we get in response are rockets and missiles, Lebanon, Gaza. So I think both sides are in a state where, as I said in response to the earlier question, they're the people who need to be convinced, and they're the last people who are going to be convinced by this rhetoric about two states.
Hello, I'm Jackson. The book makes a very compelling argument that October 7th is the logical conclusion of the failure of negotiations, but also identifies Trump's foreign policy as a deviation from traditional American policy in the region, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords. Given the conclusion of the Board of Peace meeting last week, do you see this as a potential either path forward to a tomorrow is tomorrow scenario, or similarly doomed to repeat the same mistakes that previous American administrations have attempted?
I mean, it's hard for me to say too much positive about the Trump administration. And I think their view, as you mentioned, in the first term, and I met with some of them at the time, their view was, the Palestinians have to give up their narrative. That was the view. Israel won. So the notion of anything for the refugees, they should forget it. The notion of having a capital in Jerusalem, they should forget it. The notion of having a meaningful sovereign state, they should forget it. What they should care about, and this I think is a through line for the Trump administration is, and for Trump himself, if they should just care about getting a better life. And if a better life means sacrificing the illusions that their leadership has been feeding them for decades, they should accept that. And the only reason they're not accepting it is because of the brainwashing to which they're subjected by their leadership. And I've heard that almost verbatim from a senior Obama administration official. So I don't expect that they're going to understand something about the conflict that their predecessors haven't. And the whole Board of Peace is a transactional, effort to try to buy off countries, people, and try to get benefits either for Trump or for the United States as he defines it. But I will give credit to the president in at least two respects. And he is unorthodox. Some of his unorthodoxy I find extremely distasteful. But he's prepared, for example, to talk to entities that his predecessors were not. He had his meeting with the North Korean in his first term, and he's opened a direct dialogue with Hamas in the second, which none of the administrations I've served would have even, in their wildest imagination, they would have thought about it, right? And isn't it a bit strange to say you're going to make peace between two parties, but there's one of them you're not going to talk to? I mean, then don't get in, then say you're not trying to make peace, you're trying to defeat one party. But if you're trying to negotiate a hostage deal or a truce or peace or whatever it is, and you're not prepared to talk to one of the two parties in contention, that just, as people who worked for the International Crisis Group, that goes against the basic, what I would consider basic principles of negotiations. That's one thing. He was prepared to do it. He incurred minimal domestic backlash because he just said that's what we're going to do because we want to get the hostages out, and that's what it's going to take. He also is prepared to use power in a way, again, I often find distasteful, but if you're going to try to reach an outcome, sometimes you got to do it. So yes, he put pressure on Hamas through Turkey and Qatar, and he also put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, one could debate how much pressure and whether the 20-point plan really went against Israeli interests, but it's not the plan that Prime Minister Netanyahu would have drafted if it was entirely up to him. And to this day, I think the Prime Minister fears what President might one day wake up and say we're going to do. So in the exercise of power and understanding how America can use that leverage and in the willingness to speak to adversaries or to parties, I do give him credit for that. And what I'm hoping for is that a tomorrow that is not like yesterday is that a future president could use that but tether it to a vision that goes beyond narcissism, self-dealing, and self-aggrandizement. If you had a president who had some greater moral strategic compass, but also that willingness to break norms, why not?
Hello. Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Omar. I'm from Palestine, Gaza. And the thing that I want to discuss is there's some sort of a conventional wisdom is that the IDF or the Israelis, once they step on a land, and this is something that we grew up listening
Sorry,
to.
the IDF. I didn't hear it.
Yeah. So the idea for like the Israeli military, once they step on a land or once they get in a territory, and that's something that we grew up listening to, and this is something that I'm questioning, is that they don't give up that piece of land, and whether it's like a Zionist ideology or some sort of like Israeli national ideology. My question is, when I left Gaza in 2025, I could see a lot of the territory from south of Gaza, Rafah, has been mostly taken over by the IDF. And then if we're talking about the north, it's the same, and it's been siege surrounded by all Gaza Strip. And then I was wondering, because we've heard in the news about all of this, but as a Gazan who grew up in these places and leaving that place and looking at the massive territory that's been taken, I was kind of asking, is there any kind of potential future for Gazans to be living at any kind of like, if you want, like any kind of like Palestinian or Gazan identity? Because even before the October the 7th, we've been always living under the war drones of the Israeli military. And now things are totally different. So if I'm thinking of post 2025, I would say that the IDF could potentially or completely eliminated most of the, if we can say, Hamas leaders. So what kind of future, because even when I be calling my brother or my mother right now about the third phase of the ceasefire or what is going on, is the crossing open from south of Rafah, there's a huge ambiguity in terms of we don't know and we have no idea what is going on. So I think in terms of one power being dominating on the table of negotiation right now, do you think there's any future for Gazans to be living under like under dignity or Palestinian identity?
I mean, it's a great question. Can't imagine what your family has gone through, and what Hussein and I wrote, not in the book, is that under the terms of this deal, the Palestinians in Gaza are going to go from from a situation of sheer hell to mere nightmare. That's sort of the best that they could expect for now, because the situation on the ground is there's no sense of normalcy, no way in which even if the plan were executed in the way that it ought to be in theory, the notion that Palestinians are going to be living a normal life in Gaza is something that's going to take a very, very, very long time in the best of circumstances. Now, you talk about what Israeli ambitions are. Do they ever withdraw from territory? I mean, there are examples of the Israelis withdrawing from territory. We could debate whether the occupation ever ended in Gaza, but Israeli troops withdrew. They withdrew from southern Lebanon. They withdrew partially from parts of the West Bank. So there is precedent when they're facing alternatives where they're facing a situation that they don't want to perpetuate. Why did Sharon withdraw from Gaza? Why did they leave southern Lebanon? They were facing pressures that they felt were not worth not worth it for them. Will Israel ever be prepared to I never believe in evers, but in the foreseeable future, they're going to be prepared to genuinely withdraw from Gaza and let the people of Gaza have an independent, self-determined life? It's very hard to see. I have to be candid right now. I don't see the Israelis doing that. I think they were traumatized by October 7th, so there's a combination of that and of some very ideological views about Gaza that they're not hiding. I mean, if you listen to some members of this government, what they say about Gaza, about how they want to resettle Gaza and they're never going to let, they want to expel the people, ethnically cleanse Gaza, that is part of a stream of Israeli consciousness. So you combine that with the security rationale, and so far the lack of real pressure for Israel to withdraw, it's hard to see anything but some withdrawal from the Israelis, but maintaining the right to intervene at will. Sort of the way they're dealing with the West Bank now. Whenever they want to come in, whenever they believe that their security is at risk, sometimes it's pretextual, sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's imminent, sometimes it's imagined. They believe they have the right in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Gaza to intervene because they have the ability to do so. So it's hard to see anywhere, even if the plan gets executed, which I don't think it would, to see Gazans really being able to be in control of their own destiny. They won't be in control of their security. And I do think the vision that is implicit in the Trump plan is of a Gaza that is devoid of politics. In other words, maybe the people of Gaza can get social services, can get food, can get an education, whatever. But the way it's being designed, even the Trump plan, it appears to be Palestinians who would not be able to organize politically, to speak freely politically, to continue, a genuine civic life. That's a pretty depressing image. If that's really what is in store for the people of Gaza, things may change. But right now, it's hard to see the Israelis being prepared to do much more than what I described, which is maybe a withdrawal, and if the plan, withdrawal from most of Gaza, but with oversight and with the assurance that if they see anything they don't like, they will take action against it.
There was a hand here. Yes.
And then this person here has his hand up from the beginning. But you can go there first. I'm just trying to be fair.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Is this on?
I hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talk. My name is Ramsey. Obviously, you hear a lot of rhetoric about Israel-Palestine being an existential issue for Israelis and Palestinians. You hear the word genocide thrown around a lot. In your estimation, to what extent is there a real threat in 30, 50 years, if we continue on the path we're going, that Israelis or Palestinians are not going to exist in the same way that they exist today?
So what do you mean by not exist in the way they exist today?
Well, for example, if you look at the West Bank and the expansions of settlements, right, it's hard to imagine a Palestinian collective existence if you're going to, silo them off into individual cities.
I mean, again, if nothing changes and if pressures don't grow, listen, one thing President Obama said at the end of our presidency, it was said in private, but I don't think he would mind if I repeat it, I hope not. people are saying, Israel is heading towards disaster. It's going to be either they're going to be a one-state, either they won't be Jewish or they won't be a democracy. What is it that Netanyahu doesn't see? He's being irrational. And what Obama said, and I think he was 100% right, he said, what's irrational is not the way Netanyahu is behaving. What's irrational is those who think that he's going to change his behavior simply because we ask him to. Because and so if everything continues along the current trajectory, the fragmentation of the Palestinians, that's a through line from 1948 forwards. And again, I don't have to blame the Israelis. That's the way they thought they would best assure their interests, their rights, their security, which was to divide the Palestinians, those on the outside, those in Jerusalem, those in East Jerusalem, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. The West Bank is now fragmented. The West Bank is separated from the Gaza. Gaza is now splintered as well. So it's very hard to imagine. So already the Palestinian national movement is not what it once was. So to that extent, the answer to your question is already there. If what you mean is, do I think that at some point one or the other is going to manage to expel the other and ethnically cleanse the other, that's harder for me to see. I'm not saying that it's not in people's imagination, but the regional blowback and even just the fact that the Palestinians have stayed in Gaza despite what's happened, that tells you something. And I don't think the Israeli Jews are going anywhere either. So I do think at the end of the day that both sides are going to have to find a way to coexist. But in terms of the political reality on the Palestinian side, there's been, it's one of the ironies or the paradoxes of the current situation where the Palestinian cause has seldom been as popular around the world as it is today. I mean, on campuses and around the world, and the Palestinian national movement has seldom been as weak as it is today. And so that, to that extent, the Palestinian ability to organize politically in the West Bank and Gaza, that is something that is genuinely under threat, and I don't know how that gets reversed other than if there's a change in the cost-benefit analysis that Israel makes. And right now, for reasons having to do with their real sense of insecurity and because of the ideological agenda, both are pushing in the direction of ensuring that the Palestinians can't have self-determination or a real political agency.
Hi, my name is Claire, and I've been thinking about the geopolitics of natural resources for a class here. And I was wondering what your perspective is on the water crisis, both how it's contributed to conflict in the region, but also how it could be a means of peacemaking in the future.
Good question, about which I don't claim expertise, but certainly it has been a cause of, and with climate change, it's only going to get worse. Reduced resources means that some of the old, what people thought was the old geopolitical desire for conquest of territory have made a comeback. And water, in particular in the Middle East, has been a rarefying resource. You could imagine, and this was something that the Clinton administration and others had thought of, are there ways of, through desalination plants or through water sharing, that you could use what is a scarcity as, rather than be a source of tension, a source of greater interstate and intercommunal cooperation. Yes, I would believe in that, but the politics are going to have to align, and right now the politics are headed in the direction where cooperation, normalization, sharing of resources is not at the top of people's agenda.
Thank you. My name is Lake. I was just wondering, in the face of all of the trauma that the Palestinian and Israeli people have endured since October 7th, how do we build the kind of mutual trust necessary to make a two-state solution even an imaginary thought for the collective people of Israel or Palestine?
So I might say something controversial here. I don't really believe in trust. I don't know what it actually means. I mean, I've often had, why would an Israeli, what would it take for an Israeli to trust the Palestinians after what happened? And what would it take for a Palestinian to trust the Israelis after what happened? And, I used to hear, and I'm sure you've heard all the time, well, we have to change the Palestinian textbooks and because they are feeding these ideas about Israelis, which very likely is true, and that it is feeding them, not that the images are true, but it's feeding them and making them, how could the Israelis trust the Palestinians when they read these textbooks? And I would say to the Israelis, fair enough. Maybe textbooks matter, they should change. But how much do you think a textbook weighs in the face of a Palestinian having to go through a checkpoint, or having a member of their family that was arrested without, without cause, or brutalized or tortured or killed? That's, you're not going to build trust by having people meet and talk to each other. Trust will come once they find a way to coexist. It can't be the prerequisite for coexistence, or we're going to be at this for decades and decades and decades of strife. So, in every negotiations I've been in, I never trusted that. I didn't trust the Iranians didn't trust us, but you try to find means that compensate for the lack of trust, and then you hope, didn't happen with Iran, certainly, you hope that by maintaining the deal for a certain amount of time, that mutual trust can be built. So this notion that first you need to build trust between Israelis and Palestinians when you have kind of this asymmetry of power, when you have the conditions on the ground, and when you have violence, and violence is a product of the situation on the ground, right? That's what it is. It's a conflictual situation. There'll be parties that are going to resort to all kinds of forms of violence. That's going to happen. And if what people are saying is, we first need end of violence and trust before we're going to resolve the conflict is going to be with us forever.
Hello. Also, thank you for the talk. It's been really enlightening. My name is Genevieve, and for our class, we read an excerpt of your book, so I apologize if my understanding is not like 100%. I'd love to read the book when I have the time after this, obviously. But my question is, if U.S. policy and policymakers have made such like fundamental miscalculations and like furthermore have doubled down on their failures again and again, what sort of like events or maybe even like change in administration would inspire the U.S. to change their mindset and sort of divorce from this illusion? And how likely is it that we would better employ like our leverage and our power that you mentioned and then treat the negotiations as a priority, especially considering current events in the situation with Iran?
So it's a very broad question, thanks. So one thing I do want to say, we speak in the book about the lies and the illusions, but part of it, and we also say it, why did the U.S. perpetuate and persist in this track? It's because in some ways it worked. In terms of, if you look at what at least a certain vision of U.S. interests dictated, it was quite successful, right? The U.S. wanted to be the primary power, hegemon in the region, or primary power in the region. It wanted every country in the region to look to it and not to China, not to Russia, not to anyone else. It wanted to protect the free flow of oil. It wanted to protect its partners and allies. It succeeded in that. Now, we may have real differences. I have my real criticism because it certainly didn't coincide with the rhetoric, which was promote democracy, make peace, et cetera, et cetera. None of that seemed to be, but that really was the fluff. What mattered, and I think that's what explains the fact that a strategy that by some standards was failed was replicated and replicated again and replicated again. And the peace process, yes, it didn't reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians, but it maintained the U.S. as the indispensable partner that everyone looked at, very close relations with Israel. And some of the critics were saying, if you have such close relations with Israel, you're going to jeopardize your relations with Arab governments. To the contrary, and again, Ezzedine saw this, it was, these Arab governments would run to Washington because they thought they were the only country that could put pressure on Israel, and the peace process would continue, even if you didn't get peace, but the peace process maintained the U.S. in this privileged role. Now, again, I have my real issues with that. I have a broader conversation we could have about what are really U.S. interests in the region. Does it need to maintain this kind of primacy? Is it expending resources, time, and energy that could be better spent elsewhere? But that's my own view. But from the view of the people who were sitting in the Situation Room or in the White House or in the State Department, it wasn't that bad a bargain. And so to break that, you need to convince them that the bargain wasn't worth it. And presidents, the last 3 presidents at least, Obama, Biden, Trump twice, they all have said at one point or another the U.S. needs to recalibrate its posture in the region, needs to pivot away, needs to right-size its posture. I mean, all these expressions, de-emphasize its role in the Middle East. None of them have done it. Now, you could say, oh, they were incapable, they didn't know what they were doing. No, it's because ultimately there is a gravitational pull, a structure of interest, a structure that has led the U.S. to take the position it has, which is why even today, we may be on the verge of war with Iran. you could think it's absurd, but it is a byproduct of decades of a certain involvement in the region, and I would recommend both Steve Simon's book and another book by Mark Lynch called America's Middle East, which tries to explain how these patterns get reproduced, not out of ignorance, there may be some of that, not of naivete, there may be some of that, but also because it serves a certain purpose.
Hello. I am Sama. I'm from Professor Simon's class. And looking at it from a strategic American analyst, as someone that has served, are there any serious risks why we should prolong U.S. intervention in the region?
So I didn't quite understand. Certain risks that would...
Any serious risk that further U.S. Intervention provided in the region, as the constant U.S. intervention serves as nothing but fueling for countries like Iran and for militia groups? Would there be any more serious pushback if we continue to try to force these negotiations?
Force the negotiations, so I'm sorry if I'm getting, force the negotiations or maintain our presence? Maybe I'm not. So it's a little bit sort of a segue from what I was just saying, that there are an incentive structure that leads the U.S. to stay in the region. Now, that does create threats, and 9/11, it was, you can't divorce it entirely. Maybe there are other reasons, but you can't divorce it entirely from the U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia. The rise of ISIS, you can't divorce it entirely from the U.S. invasion of Iraq and everything that followed. So there's a number, there's backlash to U.S. policy. The backlash doesn't seem to have been severe or serious enough from a U.S. perspective to warrant withdrawal. In fact, often after 9/11, the U.S. redoubled its presence in the region on the grounds that we're not going to let the terrorists get away with it. And so there's always this, and I've been in so many of these meetings where officials will say, why are we still in Iraq? Why are we still in Syria, right? We're just sitting ducks in a way, and we are the target of potential retaliation and then somebody would say, yes, but if we withdraw now, when we're under pressure, it's going to be a sign of weakness. And so we can't withdraw because they're going to be projecting that we're giving in to the threats of others. And it becomes a vicious cycle. You stay because leaving will be viewed as a victory by others, but your presence itself is not a victory. I mean, the U.S. is not, I don't think the U.S. has been really promoting any particular interest. And another credit I'll give to President Trump, he seems to be withdrawing from Syria. But the presence in Syria, justification of the presence in Syria was the presence in Syria. That we were there to protect our presence there, and if we left, we'd be giving a win to Iran, and therefore we need to stay. But there's an internal logic there that becomes self-perpetuating, and I think you need to take a distance. And President Trump, he has that ability because he escapes the laws of political gravity. He couldn't care less about what conventional wisdom says because he doesn't know what conventional wisdom is. I mean, it's sometimes being a newcomer to the business is not the worst thing. And so he said, well, why are we in Iraq, in Syria? What vital national interest do we serve by being there? So in the first time he tried to withdraw, but some of the people around him convinced him not to. This time he seems to be going through. Of course, the situation has changed. But yes, I think that becomes the vicious cycle of a presence that justifies the continuation of the presence, despite the risks.
One more question.
Hi, my name's Costin. I'm a 28. I haven't read your book, so maybe I'm getting this wrong, but if there's one suggestion I might be taking away from this talk, it's that maybe one solution is including perhaps hardliners from both sides within some form of negotiation tactic, something that might not have been done to a full extent before. My concern with that, though, is like if you say include hardliners from say either religious Zionists or Hamas within negotiations, there's a strong chance that you end up in a situation where you have defection from the opposing side's moderates who are probably instrumental in making sure that a negotiation set or an agreement, if it is formed, actually continues. Like that might be maintaining those moderate voices in their compliance to an agreement might be more crucial than even perhaps those hardliners, including them in negotiations. And I think that maybe that's an existential threat towards having those moderates continue within, like, having those moderates who are ultimately form the base of being able to form those agreements in the first place. So I'm curious about your.
I mean, it's a great question, and I've heard, and one of the reactions, not just to the book, but to things that Hussein and I have said in years past, is you're going to really undermine the, let's call them moderates, I don't like that term, but just for the sake of argument, you're going to undermine the moderates if you now start rewarding the people who've been obstructionist and violent all these years, and you're telling them, join the party. You know, what did they get for their moderation if in the end everyone is at the table and has a say? And I get that. And so members of the Fatah, the opponents to Hamas, who have been upset at people who have engaged Hamas saying, you're really pulling the rug from underneath us. Because we, against the wishes of many of our people, we continue to cooperate with Israel, we continue to cooperate with with the whole Oslo framework, and now you're saying, okay, we'll bring others. And Israeli, again, moderates, pragmatists, whatever you want to call it, have said the same. We're in a vital struggle, they tell me, even now, after I wrote the book, they say, we're in a vital struggle now for our existence with the right wing in Israel. And you're saying that these are people that should be listened to or spoken to, and I get that. And so we're not arguing that they should be at necessarily the negotiating table. I would say, ignoring their voices, ignoring their views hasn't served us. I mean, at a minimum, the quote-unquote moderates have not been able to reach the outcome for which they fought. They've been unable to do that. It's not criticism. It's not saying that, therefore, they should be excluded. But it hasn't worked. I mean, if there is a message to take from the last 30 years is that what's tried hasn't worked. And we could debate how much of it was the U.S. and how much of it was everything else. But whatever it was, the format, what people call the peace process, has failed spectacularly. I mean, could you imagine a greater failure than what we've experienced for the last 2.5 years? It's unfathomable. So all these things have to be revisited, and as I say, and bearing in mind what you said, none of these are necessarily risk-free. None of them don't. They all have costs. But if the alternative is to put our heads in the sand and say, because we don't want to undermine the moderates, because we don't want to give up the two-state solution, because there is no other, it's true, there's no other internationally recognized framework. There's no other framework that people could say, well, we have UN Security Council resolutions, so if we give that up, we give up everything. I get all that, but my comeback is always, okay, but what do you say to those like me who would argue what we have today not just has not worked, but it's failed spectacularly, and what we're heading towards is what some of you have asked before, which is Palestinians that are fragmented, that don't have any, they won't have any rights at this rate, and Israel that will live as a fortress state. That's not going to be safe, it's not going to be secure, it will have military might, but just as I mentioned earlier, the paradox of the Palestinian cause seldom being stronger, but the Palestinian movement seldom being weaker. Israel militarily has seldom been stronger, and Israel politically, diplomatically, has seldom been more isolated. So if we don't find a way to change this equation, that's where both sides are headed.
Here. That's probably our last question, unless
So 101 here.
there's more. Okay.
Second one from me.
All right.
I'm Dean. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. You mentioned about Obama's comment of how we can't expect Netanyahu to change his behavior simply by asking him, that we need to use leverage. We talk a lot about in Professor Fishere's class about what tools does the United States have to influence Israel's behavior. You think that realistically today we have the tools to influence behavior or leverage, or is it just not cost effective enough and we should just pull out of the situation?
So I wouldn't say pull out of this. However much I would argue, and we say in the book, imagine as a counterfactual a world in which the U.S. had not been involved. Would the situation between Israelis and Palestinians really be worse? I think we have to at least pause and ask that question, but put that aside. So, I mean, the tools that the U.S. has are pretty significant, right? I mean, it provides military assistance, it provides diplomatic cover, it provides all kinds of things, arms cells. I think the question, maybe if I hear you right, and maybe that's what you address in your class, is are those tools sufficient to really lead to a fundamental shift? And I'm skeptical. I admit I'm skeptical. I do think, for example, and I'd be very candid about it, I've said it publicly, I think the U.S. should have used its leverage to end the war in Gaza well before it did, and I think the Biden administration was reckless in not doing so. So I think for something like telling the Israelis, if you're not prepared to wage a war in compliance with, our domestic laws and international humanitarian law, then, we're not going to invade you, we're not going to, but we're not going to provide you with the weapons to do what you want to do unless you change the way you behave. I think that would have been a normal thing, and it always irked me when my former colleagues and friends would say we're working day and night for a ceasefire, but meanwhile you continue to provide the weapons that ensure that the fire will continue. So I think on the issues like that, pressure, leverage can work. On the fundamental issue of how Israelis and Palestinians are going to coexist, yeah, there are forms of pressure, but is it really going to change? And this goes to what I believe is deep down the feelings of Israelis and Palestinians and their politics and their societies. I'm not sure that you could get Israel to say, okay, now we're going to withdraw from the West Bank and we're going to agree that the Palestinians will have a sovereign state and we're going to divide Jerusalem. I don't know that there's the pressure, certainly that I could contemplate, that would lead an Israeli government to do that.
Last questions? Okay, those two.
Hi. One more question. You mentioned that you favored the inclusion of, let's say, a representative for Hamas in talks, and you said that...
I said that you have to listen to their voices. I don't know that I'd say they need to be at the negotiating table, but certainly President Trump is negotiating with them. But sorry, I interrupted.
So my question was, how do you reconcile that for peace for Israel, that means maybe better diplomatic relationships with the rest of the world, less pressure from the U.S., but for Hamas, their goal is directly at odds with peace. And when Israel's war with Hamas, which isn't with Palestinians, but undoubtedly affects Palestinians, have conflicting views of how that should end. So how do you end a conflict with a body that doesn't want peace while also having a representative for the Palestinian people, which is not Hamas, and there's no representative involved at this point?
So two answers to that question. First, I don't know that I would, Hamas should be in the negotiations if you're talking about a peace settlement. I do think that if you wanted to end the war in Gaza, in which Hamas is directly implicated, it's pretty hard to imagine doing that if you're not going to have communication with Hamas. Now, we do it through cutouts. We speak to the Egyptians who speak to Hamas. At some point, that becomes a bit, why not talk to them directly when Hamas wants to also hear certain assurances from the American side, which is what happened. Again, I don't think that the deal would have happened without what President Trump did. Now, you're raising a different question, and I think it's a fundamental question which we didn't address. Who represents the Palestinians today? Is it the Palestinian Authority? Is it President Abbas, who was elected, 21 years ago, I forget, whose popularity probably is less than most of the people in this class among his own people? I mean, he has said once to an American official that if elections were held, he said this back in 2015, if elections were held today, I probably would get 2 votes, myself and my mother, or his sister, I forget who he said, or my wife. Then he said, maybe not my wife. So he's aware of the fact. And, there's the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO do not represent the Palestinian people. So one of the big crises we face is there's no organized Palestinian movement. Again, which is why we called the book Tomorrow's Yesterday, because this is reminiscent of days past when you had figureheads or you had people that the Arab countries would claim would speak for the Palestinians. What really needs to happen, and I do fault the Americans, but not just the Americans for this. I fault the Americans, I fault the Palestinian leadership and Israel. There should have been elections in the Palestinian territories years and years ago. And each time, because in 2006 Hamas prevailed, there's this thought, well, we can't have elections again because what happens if they prevail again, which is a very strange, to me, concept of democracy, a very strange way of trying to revive Palestinian politics, and without a revival of Palestinian politics, you can't have real negotiations. Who does Israel negotiate with? They negotiate with somebody whose very existence is dependent on Israeli goodwill. That can't work. It just can't work, and he can't reach a deal. If he could reach a deal, he can't sell the deal, and if he could sell the deal, he can't sustain the deal because he doesn't have that kind of authority. So, one thing that's going to have to happen is a revival of Palestinian politics, and there's going to have to be some way of doing it. I don't know how it's going to be done when there's so many entities that want to prevent it because they don't like the outcome that might end it. I'm not even sure today that Hamas would prevail, but the real expression of Palestinians today would not be what they're seeing from their, what you call, and you're right, the internationally recognized leadership. So that's, the asymmetries run in all kinds of ways, but this is one that has been true since 2006. There's been an effort to prevent the revival of Palestinian politics. We asked this question in the book. In 2021, when President Biden took office, there was talk of elections among the Palestinians, and it seemed very serious for once. I mean, you've lived it many times. And then we were hearing I heard my colleagues saying, well, we can't allow this. What if Hamas prevails? We can't make the same mistake that the Bush administration made. And so Israel said, well, we're not going to allow the East Jerusalemites to vote. The Palestinian Authority said, well, if they can't vote, we're not going to have elections, and everyone is happy with that. Let's just imagine a counterfactual, and I don't say this with any certainty, but just as a thought experiment. Suppose elections had taken place. Suppose Hamas had been allowed to participate. Suppose they'd had a role. I don't think they would have prevailed like they did in 2006, but maybe they had some arrangements, some co-government with Fatah. Would October 7th have happened? I don't have the answer to that. But the evisceration of all Palestinian politics, combined with the continuation of the siege, I mean, certainly that doesn't in any way excuse what Hamas did. But, politics is all a matter of trying to influence the behavior of your adversary. I think in this case, the incentives were all wrong.
Last question. Did I say this before?
Yeah, I'll hear you on that.
That's
but if you...
for real.
So you've mentioned a few times...
No, because of the screaming, maybe we should.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned a few times that there's been big global shifts in sort of public opinion on Israel-Palestine, and I think America we've seen dramatic, shifts. You can see that in figures like Mamdani, for example, on the left and on the right. Do you think the shift in rhetoric and public opinion about Israel in the U.S., how do you view it? Do you think there's risks? Do you think there's opportunities? What's the future, and if we're talking about American public opinion towards Israel?
It's a great way to end because, and I just had this colloquy with Professor Simon, and he thought I was being unreasonably optimistic, so I'll be careful because I've rarely been accused of being an optimist, at least in recent times. There is a shift, and there are some very dangerous aspects to the shift, which is the rise of anti-Semitism, and I think we'd be completely blind if we claimed that it didn't exist. So that does exist. I think sometimes it's instrumentalized, and we don't need to get into all of that. But there is a strain, particularly on the right, I believe, on the right side of the political spectrum that also has an anti-Semitic bent. But on both sides, putting that big piece aside, there is a shift. On the Democratic side, yes, there's a much greater willingness to criticize Israel, much greater willingness to see the U.S. play a different role. When I served in government, there never was a time that I could recall where an American politician had to think about the price they would have to pay for being overly supportive of Israel, but always had to think of the price they would have to pay if they were critical of Israel. And I think that was true of the Biden administration. Maybe the Biden administration recognized too late that there was some shift in that regard. But I think now we're in a situation where, certainly in Democratic primaries, Democratic candidates have to think not just about placating one side of the political spectrum, but the other side too. And I'm sure you're all aware of elections that have taken place in New Jersey and what's happening in California, where candidates have to think twice about what are they going to answer to the question, are you going to take money from AIPAC? What do they answer to the question, was it a genocide? What is the answer to the question, would you condition aid to Israel? So now people have to think politically, not just ethically, morally, strategically, but also politically, what's the right answer? And that's new, and that will have some impact. I'm not sure how quickly, I'm not sure how decisive, but it will have some impact. On the right, and in some ways, from an Israeli perspective, that might be more worrisome, the MAGA right. What are they saying? They're not saying we care, some of them do, but most of them say, well, it's not we care about the Palestinians, we want to be fair. They say, why should the U.S. be spending this kind of money to provide assistance to a country that A, has enough money to defend itself on its own, as it's proved, and B, tends to entangle us in conflicts with which we have nothing to do. And the combination of those two does create a different political environment. Again, I don't want to overstate it because people are not going to vote necessarily on this issue. They have 1,000 reasons for which they'll vote, and this may be number 10 on their list. There may be shifts in Israel that will dampen the feelings here. So all kinds of things will happen. But I do think, I teach now at an institution that I used to be a student at 40 years ago. And the things the dialogue you hear, I'm sure you hear it in your class, the expressions you hear from students, the level of interest, the level sometimes of passion, the moral sensitivities they bring to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are things, and the historical knowledge of the conflict are things that I never experienced 40 years ago on campus. And so some people in this room, some people on other campuses who are now students, what will be their formative experience when it comes, maybe to foreign policy in general, certainly to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's what they've lived since October 7th, what they've lived, what they've witnessed, and what they've witnessed in terms of what the U.S. has done, hasn't done, the positions it's taken, the positions it hasn't taken, and in their eyes, maybe the recklessness or the fecklessness of American foreign policy. And I believe that this is the age at which people form a lot of their political views. And so when some of you will be sitting in the White House or sitting at the State Department or sitting elsewhere or running for Congress or speaking in the media, you come from it with a very different baggage than people from my generation or the generation after mine or the generation after that one. So when I look for reasons to think that tomorrow may not be quite like yesterday, I do look to this country and say, you know, I'm seeing something different. I don't know if it's going to move fast enough for some of the trends that you've mentioned before they become utterly irreversible. But I do take solace in that there's a greater moral awareness, greater interest, greater willingness to think, talk, and be active about an issue that in which the U.S. has had such a hand in the past, and as I've said, such a weak or negative hand in the past, and I hope that changes.
So maybe tomorrow will be tomorrow after all.
Maybe.
All right. Well, Rob Malley, thank you very much. And everybody, thank you for coming, and thank you for your continued interest. And the Middle East Initiative will continue to unfold. So stay tuned. Thank you.